Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ISPCAN Monthly Journal Club. ISPCAN Monthly Journal Clubs recognize author excellence, innovation, and advancements in the field of child abuse and neglect. Authors keep us learning and pushing the boundaries of research and practice to get better data, prevention, funding, policies, and systems of care to improve child protection. Thank you for joining us today as we hear from the authors of 5 articles included in a cutting-edge special issue journal. In today's session, we are honored to highlight the ISPCAN Special Issue Journal, Global Insights on the Sexual Exploitation of Boys. Due to the generous donation by the Oak Foundation, this special issue journal has been made completely open access. The focus of the special issue, a global systematic scoping literature review featuring publications from 38 countries. This issue includes multiple papers presenting new empirical data, a discussion article, and a commentary. And the emphasis? The majority of the papers are focused on the sexual exploitation of boys in lower and middle income countries. Tips for making the most of today's session. Please engage with us. We really want this to be a two-way conversation. Please take a moment to introduce yourself to the other attendees, our moderators, our featured authors in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining us from, your organization or your discipline, and get to know one another. As you listen to the presentations, make note of your questions and comments to share at the Q&A session that will take place at the end of all papers being presented. Please enter them in the Q&A box during the session while they're fresh in your mind. And please know for joining us today, a recording of this session, the author panel discussion, the presentation slides, and links to the featured articles will be sent directly to you after the webinar. Our goals for today's session is really to hear directly from the authors of the 5 papers from the Special Issue Journal with open discussion of research findings. To highlight the issues that social and gender norms play in the sexual exploitation of boys, as well as the challenges of conducting research in lower and middle income countries. And to discuss the implications of this research for improving prevention and response strategies, specifically taking data to practice. As I mentioned earlier, you'll listen to the presentations, and at the end, we will have a Q&A session. But please make note of these questions and comments during the Q&A box. And now I'm excited to present our moderators, the editors for the Special Issue Journal. Dr. Mark Kavanaugh, Director of Evident Consulting. Evident is a research consultancy based in Bangkok, Thailand, that focuses on child online protection. Mark has done research in child protection programming in the Asian Pacific region as far back as before Facebook. Mark is most proud of his work to design and lead the Disrupting Harm Project, new vital evidence regarding online child sexual exploitation and abuse in 13 African and Southeast Asian countries. And most recently, Mark and Evident have supported Child Fund Australia to refresh their Swipe Safe online safety training program for children and parents in Vietnam, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, and Indonesia. And Dr. Anna Marie Buehler, Department of Global Health and Development in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Anna is a social scientist specializing in qualitative and mixed methods research, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews. With 20 years of experience, her work focuses on critical issues like gender-based violence, masculinities, and the sexual exploitation of children. As director of the Gender Violence and Health Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, she leads a team dedicated to addressing these complex challenges globally. Her expertise spans Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the UK. And her research methodologies include randomized control trials, program evaluations, and feasibility studies. Dr. Buehler also leads the Linnae Project, working to combat sexual exploitation through understanding social norms. And it's my honor now to turn the session over to our moderators.
Thanks so much, Jane. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be sharing with you the insights in this special issue. I'm very excited to see the issue come to fruition. It's been a long journey. Today, we have you just for 90 minutes, and we're going to have, we'll have four speakers, four authors speaking to you today. One of the speakers she's been unwell, but today she woke up without any voice, which makes presenting quite tough. So I'm going to briefly speak to her paper as we proceed. But overall, the special issue that we've pulled together here really represents a year's worth of research. It has writing work from 21 different authors, as well as all the collaborators and researchers that they also worked with. So it's quite possibly, the work of more than, 30 or 40 people. We're really excited to bring it to you. The idea for a special issue was born more than 2 years ago. I was working at ECPAT International, and we dreamed up and launched a special global initiative focused on boys. The organisation had long been fighting sexual exploitation around the world at that stage, but the idea with the initiative was to focus attention specifically on how sexual exploitation was affecting boys. I'd spent a large amount of time researching this topic and talking to organisations from around the world that were part of ECPAT's network. Next slide, please, Jen. So today we're going to take you through a number of the papers. Authors are going to present on the scoping review, on intrafamilial CSEA of boys. The fourth point there, I'm going to briefly speak to Julianne's work because of her illness. We're also going to look at frontline support service workers and what their perceptions are and their knowledge is around CSEA. And we're also going to look at what groups are most affected by sexual violence in South Africa. We'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll have some closing comments at the end where we hear from the Boys Initiative head at ECPAT International, and also look at the forward research agenda. Next slide, please. So when we started to look at this special issue, we looked around and we could see that while there had been a few studies looking at the sexual exploitation of boys, they were probably few and far between. They also tended to be grey literature rather than formal literature. So I'd like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Mark Capaldi, he writes a commentary in the special issue that looks at this issue over the last 30 years. Some of the early work that I just referred to was led by him a couple of decades ago. I'll also acknowledge work by Jarrett Davis and Glenn Miles, both also authors who won't be speaking today as their colleagues are, but they did some pretty fantastic work over the last couple of decades to bring the sexual exploitation of boys in particular settings into the agenda. But the work that had been done was in quite specific contexts and populations, and it hadn't been standard to look at gender or to look at boys across the broader topic of sexual exploitation. So I'd seen that much of the formal literature also came from English-speaking countries. It came from countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK. And some of that formal literature was really excellent and told us quite a lot around the sexual exploitation of boys. But these are quite formal research projects. They didn't often take data from frontline workers. They certainly didn't often take data from young people, boys themselves. So there'd been some advocacy in this space and some robust data had been collected, but not a lot from lower and middle income countries. So when Dr. Chris Weckerle on the call today suggested a special issue on the topic of sexual exploitation of boys, I was able to jump at that chance. Somehow I roped Dr. Anna Maria-Buller into working with me as a guest editor, and I've really appreciated the chance to work with you, Anna, over the last few years to make this issue happen. I've learned a lot from you, certainly in terms of the academic corridors, and appreciate the calmness that you brought to our collaboration. From the beginning, Anna and I really focused attention on showcasing research from lower and middle income countries. Anna will speak briefly in a moment about our aims and how well we did with that. We didn't always meet the expectations we wanted to, but we did focus that attention on lower and middle income countries. A number of papers that we worked with authors through the peer review process didn't make it to the issue, but we do hope that those authors continue with their work and are published at a later date. Just briefly before I hand over to Anna, I just want to acknowledge, as Jane did as well, the support from the Oak Foundation, who have generously supported this project, and hopefully we'll be able to make the papers in the issue fully open access. Anna, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jane, as well, for that great presentation, and welcome everyone to the webinar. This is the culmination of, as Mark said, lots of work and hours put into curating this special issue and thinking about filling that gap that was in the field. And I don't think the job is done. There will be a lot more to do, and we hopefully can reflect on that once we've heard from the papers. But I want to start sort of outlining what were our expectations for this issue, and then tell you what we found as a sort of preamble to the authors and the presentation of their exciting papers. So we sought papers that showcase programming on active prevention and response. We were really, really interested in programming, in real life examples of what it means to work with boys or sexually exploited boys, and to hear from firsthand from practitioners at the front line of how it is like and what we can learn from them. We also were looking for empirical research reported from the Global South. And as you will see in our presentations, mostly we did achieve this, but sometimes we didn't. We also included papers from high-income countries, given the lack of research coming from the Global South. So immediately that's a gap that still needs to be sort of filled up and continue. We would expecting to shed light on the way vulnerable children are identified. So methodologically, we wanted to understand or learn from this issue. How do you approach the most vulnerable children or boys? And again, I think we have partially achieved this, but there's a lot of scope to continue working on this, as we will hopefully reflect later today. A very important issue to be highlighted was that of gender and the influence that gender has on the lived experience of abuse, and also on the access that boys can have on services. But and we started focusing on boys because it's a clear gap, but it doesn't mean that we haven't acknowledged children with other sexual orientations and gender identities, and that's an area that needs a lot more work. But we think that by understanding or thinking about the way gender and gender norms affect the way boys live the experience of abuse, and the way provision is also reflect these norms, we can start understanding the reality and experiences for other gender identities as well. So we hope that this issue can contribute to start that conversation that it's very much needed. And finally, we really, really wanted to amplify the practitioner perspectives. So this is mostly publishing on a journal. It's a very academic endeavor, but we wanted not just to amplify the perspectives from the research, but also wanted to give practitioners the opportunity to publish and write academically, and sort of help them produce or present their results and their experiences in this arena, which normally doesn't sort of, it studies practitioners' perspectives, but it doesn't include them. Next slide, please. So what did we find? We found 5 fantastic empirical research papers that include also a systematic review. And most of them are conducted in settings, well, they are conducted in settings across the globe. I was looking at the continents, and I think we pretty much cover most continents, and that's very exciting, and including high-income countries as well. We found, or we have as a result, a comprehensive overview of the state of the evidence on this issue that is definitely, most definitely under-researched. And it's an overview, but there's not always the depth we need on all the areas that could have been studied. So that's an area to sort of to think about while you're listening. It's important to listen to what's being said, but also to reflect on what's not there. What do we need to look for in the next special issue or in your next project? As I said, we did find that focus on the role of gender norms in shaping the experience of abuse and access to services for boys. And we hope that, I think we got the real depth on the different, on the way that gender norms can affect boys across different settings. So that's quite exciting. And we, this issue also brings both the boy survivors and the providers' perspective to the fore. So as you will see, the methodologies used also gave boys the opportunity to bring their voices to the fore and not just doing research on them, but research with them and making them a real important and core part of the research, which I think is really important when working with vulnerable populations as these ones. So without much further ado, I leave you with Mark and the authors of this amazing special issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. I'll introduce to you briefly the first speaker, Dr. Christine Weckerle, who is from the Department of Paediatrics at McMaster University. Had the pleasure of working with Chris for a few years now, and she's going to present the findings of the global systematic review. All yours, Chris. We can't see you yet, Chris. Christine, are you still there?
Oh, Mark, did we lose Chris?
No. Christine, can you hear us? Are you there still? We might have lost her. Shall I move to the next speaker, Jane?
I think we should.
Sure. Okay. Hopefully we'll find Chris while I introduce the next speaker. Anna Lucia, I hope you're ready to proceed. So the next speaker is Anna Lucia Mariaka Pacheco. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. This is a really interesting study that used a quite clever and really respectful approach with its participants. Anna Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the ESPCAN for hosting this important webinar, and special thanks to the organizing team for having me here today. My name is Ana Lucia Mariaca Pacheco, and my research team also includes Andres Eduardo Buenaventura and Dr. Glenn Miles. To quickly summarize our findings, we conducted 6 rounds of interviews with 10 individuals who reported enduring child sexual exploitation and abuse by family members during their boyhood. We also used the co-productive approach, which allowed us to work very closely with these survivors and continuously adapt to the study methodology based on their inputs and suggestions. Within the articles, you can see these 10 stories in detail as we deep dive into the modus operandi of the crimes. So as we have very short time, I'll go straight into the important findings, the institutional failures of male survivors. For male survivors. All of our participants reported experiencing significant gender biases and skepticism about their victimization when dealing with police, medical staff, and mental health professionals. The survivors told us that the service providers seldomly believed their claims and often dismissed them by the very same people that it was their job to do and help them. We believe that the socially constructed gender biases were determining factors in these institutional failures because such biases served as a kind of cognitive shortcut. These shortcuts led to frontline professionals to mistakenly assume that the perpetrators of the sexual abuse and exploitation must be men and the victims must be women and girls. And frontline professionals themselves have reported in other studies that these biases impact them even when in contact with a potential boy victim. The survivors widely reported that experiencing disbelief, biases, and skepticism from frontline professionals left them feeling traumatized, and such consistently negative experiences caused them to fear engaging with service providers or take out their cases when it came to prosecution. The survivors also told us that most frontline professionals in their case were not effective in recognizing visible and behavioral indicators of their trauma. In contrast, they reported receiving better support from service providers who knew in advance how to implement trauma-informed practices by recognizing indicators and how to support victims from child sexual exploitation. Next slide, please. While our sample size was small, we found that it is important to note that the presence of female perpetrators was nearly universal in the study. 9 out of the 10 participants reported women either trafficked or abused them sexually, and 6 participants reported that their mothers were leading perpetrators in their case. Sexually abusive relationships between women and boys can be difficult to identify because women can be seen as mothers, teachers, caregivers, and they can bathe, dress, examine, or touch children in ways that do not normally arise suspicion from others. The literature further suggests that boys exploited by adult women may struggle to identify themselves as victims and presenting additional barriers for disclosure. And earlier studies on child sexual exploitation suggested that women involved in these crimes often play a supporting or passive role by enabling men in their lives to sexually exploit the children, but nothing further. The idea was very inconsistent with our findings, as survivors told us that women repeatedly trafficked them and exploited them sexually, with some women acting violent or sadistic. As survivor participants stated, women, on the other hand, were absolutely relentless. It seemed that the more I cried and tried to plead with them, the more that it would turn them on and the more abuse I would suffer. Therefore, it is important to not dismiss cases or claims with female perpetration. Next slide, please. Identifying victims can be more challenging when their exploiters are family members. And this is because the presence of the familiar dynamic between the exploiter and the child provides many distinct advantages to the perpetrators. The family member might not be the first person that a police officer, for example, would suspect to be involved. A familiar perpetrator can plan to bring their victims to activities that they describe as camping trips, road trips, or family holidays, for example. And to an outside observer, these activities can quickly be perceived as routine family outings and merit no suspicion or second thought. And due to their early access to children as family members, familiar perpetrators are in the advantaged position to groom and manipulate children to see themselves as a sex object from a very young age. In addition, familiar perpetrators can more easily provide plausible explanations for a child's visible physical markings or other indicators of their victimization to mitigate other suspicion. For example, the exploited family member can more easily and convincingly describe a boy victim as clumsy, poorly behaved, to a medical provider, to a school professional, or to law enforcement. Familiar perpetrators also often employ deliberately vague and misleading terminologies to refer to their sexual exploitation, using words such as playtime or having a dream or love to minimize other suspicions in them when there's a case of child exploitation and the child is trying to disclose using those terms. So when a child is disclosing, the child can claim, I had a dream that I was being touched. And by stating this, their claims will be very easily dismissed by those hearing them. Next slide, please. One of the toolkit items created by this research were visual indicators, which went deeper than traditional ones, such as bruises or bags under the eyes. For example, we can see here physical signs of sexual abuse and exploitation that medical staff and law enforcement and other frontline providers can learn when they come in contact with the child and what they can look out for. One of the most common indicators were constant throat infections. Dentists or doctors can use these indicators if an infant or toddler or even teenager has repeated throat infections leading to their tonsils being removed. Instead, they can really reflect and think critically about why a child has over 17 infections in 1 year, which is what happened to a few of our survivors. Another is drugs in the bloodstream. Survivor participants stated that this was done to them, and they were told that they were getting their vitamins, which was usually done during the movement of the child so that they could not run away or prior to their exploitation. And the youngest age that were getting these injections from drugs were in their toddler years. So it is very important to pay attention regardless of the child's age. Next slide, please. And we expanded upon these physical indicators into emotional, psychological, and behavior indicators of sexual abuse and exploitation. And we hope that to help frontline professionals and families identify these red flags earlier on. So here I'll highlight 2 examples. Fear of flashing lights, and this is from the creation of child abuse, sexual abuse material, CAMSA. For example, when a child is getting their picture taken for school picture day, do they seem extremely uncomfortable? With their friends, do they attempt to move away from the camera? The next one is fear of male children or male adults. And this is when there has been extreme violent abuse, assault, or trafficking done by male perpetrators. And this point actually highlighted the need for more female frontline service providers to help with disclosures. Next slide, please. And there already are a few tests that can be used to help potentially identify children that are experiencing adverse childhood experiences. For the ACEs test, scores can range from 1 to 10, and there is significant correlations between highly reported ACEs scores 4 or more and the presence of psychological and sociological ailments, which negatively affect and impact the quality of the individual's quality of life, their ability to form relationships, earning potential, or get an education or be gainfully employed. And these tests can be done by adults too, looking back into their history to understand why they may feel a certain way, or children trying to understand the situation they are in. This can be even a self-test. This can be done in a therapeutic session with law enforcement, with medical staff. And as we see here, the 10 participants in the research on the familiar trafficking scored over 4, with 9 participants scoring 7 or more. This test was a clear sign to them to understand that there was a need to stop minimizing their feelings, their thoughts, and their experiences, because it did have an impact on themselves as adults. And it hopefully will allow them to begin to address their problems and concerns. And my hope is that more frontline professionals can use these tools and tests when they suspect a child is being exploited or abused, and hopefully more children can be identified and help earlier on. Next slide, please. And service providers are in a better position to help survivors if they know beforehand how to recognize these indicators and how to support these male victims in child sexual abuse or trafficking circumstances. And it is particularly important that with familiar perpetrators, because the indicators might be present, even if a child attends school, participates in extracurricular activities, and then even goes home every single day. We recommend frontline professionals, educators, and other service providers in regular contact with children to receive trauma-informed training on detecting potential victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation. And these training activities must contain content which addresses familiar perpetration. We also believe to raise awareness on gender biases. As we discussed earlier, this kind of training can help professionals in contact with potentially vulnerable boys to remain objective with their interactions and provide better support. And on behalf of my team, I would like to thank the Oak Foundation for making this article free access to researchers, frontline service providers, educators, law enforcement, and most importantly, to the survivors around the world. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Annaluce. That was really a fantastic summary of a really complex piece of work. And I'd certainly encourage everyone present to spend some time to engage with it. It's not an easy read, but a really important one to hear from those experiences of survivors. Next up, Jen, I'm going to go back to Chris. Chris is back on. We had technical difficulties, as you can guarantee when you try to do something online. So we go back to Chris's slides, and Dr. Chris Reckley from the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster. I'll give the floor to you to speak about the global systematic review of the literature. Thanks, Chris, all yours.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks, Anna, to you both for your tremendous insight and work in developing this special issue for child abuse and neglect. For anyone who doesn't know, I am the editor-in-chief of Child Abuse and Neglect. And I wanted, as I see all the wonderful attendees from across the world, I also want to give a wave to Dr. Jordan Greenbaum, who is in attendance and has done a prior special issue on child sexual exploitation in child abuse and neglect. We're very happy that access is available to the articles in this special issue, and thank the Oak Foundation for stepping up for supporting work in the child maltreatment space, as I know it does, and for this particular topic as well. I came into this topic with a question: what about the boys? And that has led us to look at both child sexual abuse as well as now child sexual exploitation and other elements of what boys experience but is under attended or underreported, like sexual abuse within dating relationships. So we're really on an important pathway, although girls are perhaps the dominant victim in many countries. In some situations, boys are the dominant victim, and it's time that we reach out and really put our arms around boys who've been sexually abused and exploited, and bring them into services that in many cases we have yet to create, as we are getting more and more involved in trauma-informed services, trauma-informed organizations. So we have been working on a systematic review, our scoping review, for over 3 years, beginning at the invitation of Mark, as he mentioned. And I'd like to thank many of my trainees who have worked on this and have come and gone, mainly gone to medical school. Corinne Moss, Savannah Smith, Catherine Kim, Nick Hua, Noella Norona, and all the other volunteers and supporters who are acknowledged on this paper. So next slide. So one of the things that is really from the outset important for us to know about is, we may all have a very clear understanding what sexual abuse of children is, but how is it getting measured in research? And if something's getting measured with, one item, we know that, there's room for improvement. So it has been measured in the research with one item. That have you ever received anything such as money, gifts, help with schoolwork, or something else that was given to you so you would have sex with the perpetrator? This idea of exchange, that sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of children has something to do with exchange. And in other cases, you might get 3 questions in terms of identifying, well, it's not just like money or tangibles, it could be a better grade, or it could be uniforms or food or something similar. So there is no standard questionnaire used for measuring sexual exploitation of children, which points us to the need for some creation of a standard measure. And to start with some of the words from children, some quotes. Sometimes I ask myself how I got this far, as I wish I had not been doing it, said an adolescent male. And my family is very poor. My brother was sick, so I wanted to help my mother. I was only 8 years old. This was from a 12-year-old. So that boys move into sexual exploitation of children through a variety of ways, and it can include via abduction, even pressure and lying, deceiving the child as to what will come, and then familial pressures and tolerance of their child sexual exploitation for part of family finances. So we have 38 unique countries, and this is the Prisma map that shows our 3 searches to make sure we were capturing as many articles as possible in the peer-reviewed and the gray literature, because ECPAT has over 100 members, and those members have been very active, and we want to pull on their reports. So we have 38 countries, but what I want to highlight is that nearly all countries signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that indicate children have a right to be protected from all forms of violence. So 196 countries had signed that. And but what we know is that while the US contributed the most studies with 19 studies, they definitely have a very prevalent situation in terms of, just for example, their border traffic with Mexico, and that makes California the state with the highest sexual exploitation of children cases. So there's a lot of work to be done, some blind eyes happening or head sticking in the sand, and we need to, one part of this is raising awareness. The optional protocol of the UN was ratified by 180, and the United Nations Global Report on Trafficking, which compiled the experiences of over 50,000 victims, tapped 166 countries. So, when we look at these numbers, we're happy that we have 81 countries, but clearly there's much more work to be done, more research to be done. And I hope that the funders of the world create special calls for proposals in this area. And that just, again, another depiction of how we got to our 81 documents in 38 unique countries. And going to the unique findings, taking a broad-based ecological approach, some of our key findings in terms of individual factors was that the youngest participants of a sexual exploitation of children were in the 6 to 7 year old age, but most of the onset was in early adolescence, 12 and older. Sexual orientation was very rarely queried of even the adolescents or late adolescents. 6 peer-reviewed studies looked at that. And as Anna alluded, more to be done in the gender space. And a significant percentage of boys with severe physical disabilities experience exploitation at 4 times the increased odds. So we know that boys are vulnerable because of the taboos for boys, but we see even greater vulnerabilities. And the rates are for males in some situations higher than females. In terms of family and relationships, we see that homelessness is a big risk factor. And in a Canadian study, in fact, female offenders were very highly represented. And as we go through and talk about vulnerabilities, many of the sexual exploitation of children cases have had already child welfare involvement. Trans youth were more vulnerable. The recurring family kinds of situations were household strain, things like child maltreatment, parental substance use. And one study found that about 7% of exploited boys also reported dating violence. So adolescent dating violence is an area that was really rarely looked at. In terms of community factors, there was also, starting to see these multiplication, accumulation of risk factors like community violence, what happens with online online platforms where perpetrators can access, they're going to access boys where they're at in gaming platforms and move from there. Boys are subject to the manipulation that, for instance, they would gain permanent immigration status, that the stories that, oh, this is not harmful, and the myth that boys should be happy to receive any kind of sex, that they should be sexually active, that they should resolve all their conflicts and problems themselves, etc. In terms of victim correlates, we're not surprised to see negative emotionality. We are surprised that very few tapped post-traumatic stress symptomatology, and that's clearly a future need area. We're not surprised that substance abuse was heavier for boys, and that health care providers sometimes presented difficulties for boys who needed sexual disease testing and treatment or referrals. And in terms of the offender and facilitator characteristics, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of research on those elements, and there needs to be. But the range of offenders were broad: educators, religious persons, peers, neighbors, someone they trusted, and opportunistic perpetrators. And the facilitator would be someone who was a go-between the victim and the offender. They may be someone who supported criminal activities such as providing food, cooking, housing, kind of taking on a maternal role. And that there is a range of control strategies like money, deception, bribery, video games, access to drugs, all the like that you would expect in child sexual abuse. So the implication, I just put a definition: a disaster is a serious disruption on the functioning of a community or society leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts. And I think CSE is our unnatural disaster. It is not an earthquake, but it should be feeling like an earthquake to us, all of us, because it destroys the fabric of our communities. It points to the holes in our social safety nets, and it really is a call to action to really attack this problem as it is an emergency, as it is a disaster. And some of the things we can do is have research support ongoing surveillance to get that research, more resource to rehab initiatives, parenting education, boy-specific services that welcome diversity, and everything that can be done in law to make this a more protective environment for boys. And that might include something like having a child commissioner and staff training, which I know Evident is more involved with. So I thank you. If you want to connect with me on Twitter, Instagram, and youthresilience.net. We do have some educational videos on Resilience in Youth YouTube channel, and maybe someone at IPSCAN can put those links up in the chat. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you, Chris, so much for that presentation. It's an incredibly tough ask to summarize research from 81 papers, including more than 240,000 participants, but you've given it a red hot go. So thank you for the summary. And once again, just encourage people to dive into this piece. A lot of what Chris was saying is really interesting. It's not surprising to see X, or we expected to see Y. And I think that in itself is useful. Looking across in such a systematic way, looking across the research, allows us to say with some confidence that these are in fact what the data are showing us. And as Chris pointed out, the review included both formal literature so peer-reviewed literature, as well as grey literature, including that was gathered through a number of ECPAT International's members around the world. So as Chris said, more than 100 organisations fighting child sexual exploitation took part in helping gather all the published research. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate you presenting. Jen, I'm going to move to, you're all over it. Thank you so much. So this is the very brief Mark Kavanagh version of this research because Julianne Corboz has been so sick that she can't speak today. So I've unfortunately had to step in, which I'm sure is a shame for everyone. I won't do the research justice as they would. This piece of work is incredibly important. It was led by the All Survivors Project, really great, feisty little organisation that has been making a lot of noise about sexual violence against men and boys, particularly in fragile situations and conflict situations. This piece of research that I'll briefly describe to you was looking at sexual violence victims in Afghanistan. Next slide, please, Jen. So briefly looking across the methodology for their work, there was an initial desk review where they certainly looked at existing literature in the country that showed evidence of sexual violence against boys. Now, it's an interesting paper to read because a lot of what they were looking at was sometimes reading between the lines. So there's quite a bit of that captured in the publication. They conducted stakeholder interviews with 10 stakeholders, including government, national and international NGOs and UN agencies. But point 4 there you can see is the most interesting to me, is interviews with 27 male victim survivors. So these young men had the courage to have discussions about their experiences of accessing services. One thing that the paper deals well with is that the researchers did not seek to identify people's sexuality or gender identity through the questions that they asked, because it's such a complex conversation to have. There's so much stigma and discrimination attached to it. So these are really difficult conversations to have. So although that's not explicitly described in the findings, they are speaking to the influences or the impacts on people with diverse sexual orientation and gender identity in this very complex context. Next slide, please, Jen. So some of the sort of key conclusions from the research were that survivor-centred healthcare for male victims really needs quite substantial work to address barriers. They looked at the socio-ecological framework to organise the barriers that were identified by victims. They talked about at the community level, threats of violence, fears of discrimination and being outed or being named as a victim were really prominent. The researchers speak about how formal systems and barriers also exist. So expectations that your confidentiality will be kept by health professionals was not something that survivors were confident of. So there's a real concern with those structures that should be confidential, that healthcare should be provided confidentially, but that the systems were loose around these issues. And in an individual and relational issue, of course, the experiences of stigma and discrimination were prominent. They spoke about how services for survivors of sexual violence absolutely need to address or accommodate people with diverse sexuality and gender identity. But perhaps that's doing so in ways that doesn't require that labelling as well, given the complexity of the situation. And then the last point there, that targeted interventions are necessary to improve the knowledge and skills of healthcare providers to ensure that they do understand the unique experiences of male survivors. A lot of what Anna Lucia spoke about in her presentation is really relevant here. We really need to change the way that service providers are engaging with male survivors, so they fully grasp that these circumstances, the situation that these people have been through, have unique gender-based influences. I'm going to leave it there for that presentation and apologise again if I didn't do justice to Julianne, and I hope you get better soon. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Mari Nodzensky. So Mari comes to us from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's studying or working with Anna Marie Buller, and she's going to present to you on findings from the survey of support service workers that was conducted by ECPAT International in a number of countries over the last few years. Floor is yours, Mari.
Thank you, Mark. I'm not sure if you can see me. And thank you very much to all attendees for joining us today. I'll be presenting this next paper, which, as you can see, was co-authored with Jared Davis, who was closely involved in the study design and data collection for the Global Boys Initiative, as Mark mentioned earlier. So let's get to it. Next slide, please. Okay, let me start by giving you a little bit of background on this study. The data was collected as part of ECPAT International's Global Boys Initiative, which is a recent multi-country project aimed at building an evidence base on the sexual exploitation of boys. And the survey of frontline support workers, which is the focus of our paper, was one of the 4 research activities conducted for this project. The survey is a mixed methods online survey. It contained 121 multiple choice and short open answer questions. It was conducted with 404 frontline support workers across 7 different countries. Those countries were India, Bolivia, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Morocco, and Hungary. And the data was collected between April and September 2021. So in this particular paper, we explore the responses from frontline support workers regarding their work with boys who have experienced sexual exploitation and abuse, in an attempt to identify some trends, some common themes, particularly in relation to the vulnerabilities of boys and to barriers to disclosures. To answer these questions, we conducted a descriptive analysis of selected quantitative variables from the survey data. What that means is that no statistical analysis was performed to establish the significance of data differences between the different countries. Moving on to the next slide. So our first key finding from the research is that despite the important social, economic, cultural differences between the 7 countries surveyed, support workers reported on broad experiences and vulnerabilities that do seem to be shared by young male victims across these diverse contexts. Coming to our first point, when we asked the support workers to estimate the proportion of boys in their caseloads that had experienced child sexual exploitation or abuse, well, they reported that over 1/3 of male children had such an experience. Workers in South Asia, that's India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, had some of the highest estimates, and the lowest estimate was in Hungary. A second trend we identified was in relation to vulnerabilities. So in the survey, we gave support workers a list of 32 different factors, which were categorized as either traditional beliefs and practices or as social and economic factors. And these factors were all potentially increasing boys' vulnerability to sexual exploitation. And we asked workers to select the top factors which they believe increases vulnerability. And what we found is that nearly half of all support workers indicated extreme poverty as a top socioeconomic vulnerability factor. The only country that differed was South Korea. That might be explained by the nation's relative higher level of economic development. So poverty was not considered a top factor. Instead, in South Korea, support workers were more likely to identify social isolation or family violence as top vulnerability factors. Another important socioeconomic factor that many workers cited was living or working on the street, and that also to some extent relates to poverty. And I would also just like to quickly mention that in a number of countries, workers cited factors like children having to migrate for work, or factors like being left behind by migrating parents as vulnerability factors. And what this highlights is that there's a close link between sexual exploitation, poverty, and migration. And actually, these links have been documented in existing research already. Moving on to the next point, another interesting trend relates to age at time of first abuse. So 40% of support workers indicated that boys most commonly first experience sexual abuse or exploitation between 11 and 15 years old. And a further 30% believed that boys were most commonly between 6 and 10 years old. So this finding that on average, boys might be younger than girls at the time of abuse is consistent with what has been observed in other studies as well. And our final point relates to the gender of offenders and about the relationship between offenders and the boys that providers support. So the perceived relationships of male offenders to victims varied from country to country. In 3 countries, workers were more likely to identify male offenders as family members or relatives. But in contrast, in the 4 other countries, the male offenders were most commonly reported to be individuals outside the family, such as family friends, community members, or persons in authority. Women were in somewhat lower proportions also reported to be a common offender, and they were also mostly described as family friends or community members over 18 years old. Now, despite these slight variations, what was observed across the data set is that support workers were less likely to identify foreigners as offenders in comparison to what we would consider local or national individuals. And in particular, foreign strangers, that's foreigners not previously known to the children, were really seldom cited by participants across all countries. So really, in summary, it was a smaller proportion of offenders that might be strangers to children, but when these strangers are cited, they're considered to be national individuals rather than foreigners. Moving on to our next slide, and our second key finding from the research is that there is a critical role for gender norms as both a vulnerability factor and a barrier to disclosure. So as I mentioned earlier, we gave support workers a list of 32 factors that increased boys' vulnerability. And you'll remember that workers had identified extreme poverty as a top socioeconomic factor. So now turning to factors related to traditional beliefs and practices, we found that 64% identified the stigma and shame that victims experience. That includes the culture of silence that surrounds the experiences of sexual abuse as a critical vulnerability factor. And more than half of workers also thought that beliefs such as boys are strong, boys are not vulnerable, boys are able to protect themselves were a top vulnerability factor. And in addition to vulnerability, these gender norms were also perceived to hinder disclosure among boys. Workers identified masculine norms that affect both how boys view themselves. So you'll see boys are reluctant to view themselves as victims, but also how boys others view them and will respond as primary barriers to disclosure. So moving on to our final slide. Based on these findings, some of which are consistent with existing research, including research presented by some of my colleagues today, what could be some important implications for practice and for research? Really, we've been talking for a long time about how gender norms create certain expectations for girls, how they constrain their possibilities, what they can, what they cannot do. And for years now, we've also been having conversations about how to challenge these gender norms for girls, not only to reduce their vulnerabilities, but also to help them, allow them to realize their full potential. Now, it's a conversation that's not always easily translated for boys, although we'll admit it's slowly changing, but we still tend to notice less how these same rigid gender norms impact boys. For instance, when we assume boys are naturally more resilient to sexual victimization, that they're more capable of protecting themselves, that they have a lot more agency and in all aspects of their lives, including in their intimate relationships. Well, these are all constructions that conflict with the idea that they could also be vulnerable to sexual abuse. And this often leads to boys themselves resisting that label of victim. And we also know that these rigid gender norms, they prevent boys from telling people around them that they've been harmed, either because they're ashamed, because they fear how others might respond, or simply because they abide by those teachings that tell them, be tough, stand up for yourself. And when it comes to an adult abusing them, expecting boys to defend themselves is obviously not a reasonable nor an acceptable expectation. But boys very often feel that's what they're supposed to do. So I would just like to conclude that if we're going to make it easier for boys to get help, we must first closely examine those messages that boys grow up with and live with, and challenging these gender norms, these narratives among boys and among the wider public to normalize the idea that abuse of boys is also a reality, to allow them to express their needs in a healthy way would be, of course, beneficial to the boys themselves. But these conversations would also help a better understanding among the adults, among the care providers of how boys are affected, how these norms affect how they externalize emotions, how they manifest their need for help. And this is really at the core of creating a more tailored approach to effectively reach out to boys and to support them. And on this note, I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share the findings. And thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Mari, so much for your presentation. Once again, a really tough gig to present such a rich wealth of data. Thanks so much. I'm now going to introduce our final author for her presentation now. So Nontokozo Langwanya from Oxford University, the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, is going to present some research from South Africa. Now she's struggling with flight delays today, so hopefully we're able to proceed without too many interruptions. So good luck, Nontokozo.
Thank you. I am still at the airport. Hopefully you can hear me. There'll be some background noise. I apologize for that. And I'll switch off my camera to conserve the phone's battery. So it's an honor to join the team today, reflecting on sexual exploitation of boys. And the paper I'm presenting on is a group most affected by sexual violence. Next slide, please. So we're going to be speaking using data from the Mzansi-Wako cohort. The Mzansi-Wako cohort is a study that is based in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. So that region highlighted in yellow on the bottom right of your screen. We followed up adolescents 3 times in the year 2014, 2016, and 2018. And the sample roughly comprised of an equal distribution of females and males. So 43% males and 57% females. Next, please. And during each of these waves, sorry, just a backslide so that that's, but during each of these waves, we asked adolescents to report on 3 forms of sexual violence. This included non-contact sexual violence, which was the showing of private parts when one did not want to do so. We then looked, and then we asked our participants to also report on contact forms of sexual violence. This included forced sexual debut, attempted or penetrative oral sex for both males and females. We also then included attempted forms of forced sex, including the touching of private parts. And lastly, we looked at exploitative sexual violence, which was having sex in exchange of goods, money, or marks. Next slide. What this bar shows is the first section, which is non-contact forms of sexual violence. I report here lifetime prevalence, which is the accumulative reporting of years between the first wave and the fourth wave and the third wave. And what we see here in the white bar are the overall rates of lifetime sexual violence, which is about 6%. And then what you see in the first bar in a light yellow are boys, and then in orange are girls. And what we really saw for non-contact forms of sexual violence was that the lifetime prevalence was relatively comparable between both boys and girls. This meant that boys were equally as likely as girls to report being forced to show their private parts when they did not want to. Next, please. The next bar then shows contact forms of violence. And here we see a difference by sex. Overall, 9% of our adolescents reported lifetime exposure to contact form of sexual violence. But what we do see here is a difference for boys and girls, whereby boys were less likely to report contact forms than girls. And this is 4.6% compared to the orange bar, which is 12%. Next slide. We then did our results for exploitative sexual violence. And this is really one of the first studies that reports on the rate at which boys are also exchanging sex for goods, money, and better grades at school. We saw relatively a small difference between boys and girls. We still see that 1 in 10 boys reported that in their lifetime, with the average age being 13 at grade 1, and then up to 18 at grade 2, had sex when they did not want to, but wanted to get material goods such as transport, food, money, or a better grade. Overall, for all adolescents, we saw that 15% had been exposed to transactional sexual violence. Next slide. When we combine these, so non-contact, contact, and sexual exploitation, we do see that girls are more disproportionately affected by sexual violence, but we also see a higher rate of sexual violence among boys, almost 1 in 5. I'll just give that. Thank you for your patience with that. So for any sexual violence, we do see that 1 in 5 boys had reported any form of sexual violence, so non-contact, contact, and sexual exploitation. What this really did, it encouraged us to look at how we view childhood versus sex, especially for sexual exploitation. We know that for sexual exploitation, majority of our studies or our interventions are predominantly focused on females. Yet we see that 1 in 5 boys were also likely to experience sexual exploitation. For contact forms, it's clear that girls were more likely to be exposed to forced sex an early sexual baby. But we do see that boys too are what this 5% represents and how this socioeconomic status of those young boys place them at risk of contact forms. In terms of non-contact, this really highlighted how much of childhood perhaps is the driver of risk. Typically, conceptualized risk is just happening at one given time. But the non-contact prevalence estimate really encourages to think of risk as a continuum that is already existing at an early age. And perhaps as girls and boys transition into early adolescence and adulthood, they sexual exploitation. Next. So when we look by age, we saw no differences for boys and girls. And this graph just really shows that age is also a key factor for boys, just like it is for girls. As boys progressed, we saw an increase in all of those forms of sexual violence. And this trend differed very slightly for girls. Again, highlighting potentially the idea of looking at childhood before looking at some of the gender differences. Next slide, please. So while this work was predominantly looking at girls, it really forced us to look at the life course and thinking about how all of the different provisions we have been working to support girls around and to support prevention for sexual violence among girls might look like for boys. And so the next step of this research is really to see whether or not current provisions that have been proven and tested for girls would also be applicable to reducing sexual violence among boys. Next slide, please. And the slide just thanks everyone who participated in the study and data collection. And just a reminder of why it's important to think about sexual violence within the African continent is because of the booming youth that it will have by the year 2050. Thank you so much, and thank you for the patience with the noise.
Thanks, Nantagozo. We got there. We broke up a little bit, but I appreciate you pushing through. I've had to present from an airport lounge before, so I know what it's like. Stressful, but you did excellently. Thank you. We have a few minutes now for some Q&A. I've been looking at the Q&A box as we went through, and I've just picked a couple of questions. I know that some of the authors have also been responding in the Q&A box too. But I'd like to propose to you, Anna Lucia, a question that you answered regarding participant selection for your study. Would you like to speak a bit more about that? How did you choose, or how did you identify the participants for your study? Try and keep the answers to a minute or two, please.
Okay, I'll try to do this quickly. So for the participants in the intrafamilial child abuse study, those 10 were identified because they were a part of a larger study where 40 male survivors of child sexual abuse were interviewed. And those 10 out of those 40 also had stories of trafficking, and the traffickers happened to be their family members. So then I was able to then ask them, afterwards, do you consent to be a part of this additional study? And they said yes, and then that's how we went deeper into the study here, the intrafamilial abuse of boys. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much. There was a question from a participant in Pakistan who said that the frequency of child sexual abuse is higher in boys than girls in some studies from the country. So Mari, I wanted to see whether you'd like to talk a little bit about why you think that might have been the case. It was also reflected, I know, in the Global Boys Initiative data as well. Mari, are you there?
Sorry, Mark, there was some disconnect here. I couldn't hear the question, sorry.
Okay, let me pose it again. So there was a question from a participant in Pakistan commenting how in that country, the frequency or the prevalence of child sexual abuse has been counted actually as higher in boys than in girls, which sort of seems to buck the trend across other countries in the world. I'm just wondering if you had any insights from looking at your data as to that was the same that you found, and why you think that might be.
Yes, yes, it's true that in the 7 countries that were surveyed, support workers reported some of the highest proportions of boys in their caseloads in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and Morocco as well. But you can see, like in those South Asian countries, that the rates were pretty high. We don't have the obviously the level of data as to provide an explanation. I think possibly one of the reasons we discussed with Jarrett when putting together the paper was that in some countries that recently, or had a fairly recent experience of a conflict, there might be some factors that make it easier for boys to be victimized, or at least for boys to come forward. There might be more, as we know, during conflicts, boys are more vulnerable to abuse. So there might be more services as well that cater to these boys. So more visibility as well. So I'm not sure if the rates we have are representative of a real trend, or if these boys are just more easily identified in these countries, maybe. But it's difficult to tell.
Thanks, Mari. Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if the sort of level of supervision given to girls where we think they're more at risk might also play in. Chris, a quick question for you. I saw you answered it in the chat box, but I think it's really fascinating. What the global literature says about delayed disclosure or findings related to adult men or people with diverse sexual orientation and gender identity later in life disclosing childhood abuse.
Yeah, I think the general consensus is that most victims do not tell anyone. And so for a majority of victims, delayed disclosure is actually the norm. And then when they do tell someone, they may tell someone in therapy or their intimate, partner. And then that kind of makes sense in terms of the victim raising the odds that they will receive a compassionate response to the disclosure. So, in general, the idea of disclosure leads to more positive outcomes, unless the disclosure experience was negative. So either the person was not believed, or they were shamed for it, they lost friends, they lost opportunities over it. So there's been, a review article by Jill McTavish, and is published in Child Abuse and Neglect, that goes through the whole literature on disclosure and what it means when you have a negative response to disclosure, a positive response to disclosure, or some mixed response to disclosure. So I think as providers out there, we have a duty to provide positive responses to disclosure, which means things like saying, I believe you, thank you for sharing, this must have been difficult, I'm sorry that you went through this experience. Sadly, in our world, you're not the only one. And there is some help services, information available that you might find helpful. How can I help you?
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to close the Q&A because we still have a couple of presentations before we finish today, which I'd like to move to. There was one question, well, there's a number of questions actually from people asking about whether there's studies in particular regions of the world, so in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Caribbean, in Central America. There are some studies, and they're captured in the global systematic review that Chris spoke about today. So I will strongly encourage you to dive into that article. But I think there's really a gap, and that's a nice segue into our next presentation. I'd like to introduce the head of the Global Boys Initiative from ECPAT International, Francesco Sesson, to speak briefly about how this research is being used, how the initiative is working in other spaces as ECPAT uses this data as they work to service provision improvement and things like this. Francesco, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for the initiative and for convening this very important webinar. I'm very happy to see more momentum and more discussions happening around this, and I'm particularly glad to do the closing of this session to also tell you a little bit about how we use all the evidence and data that was gathered through the different research projects that were just presented for actually construct the priorities of the Global Boys Initiative and really transforming then research into action. It's needless to say that it was impossible to do all the Global Boys Initiative and make it so clear in focus from a programmatic perspective without having this evidence and data that were really groundbreaking, because they allowed us to understand what needs to be done and how it needs to be done moving forward. So just very quickly, I have one slide that just tells you a little bit about what are the 3 key areas in which we were able to use the research that was presented for our work. So the first one was programs. So we really used, we spent some time in analyzing the recommendations and evidence collected through the research, and specifically on all the analysis that was done on the needs of frontline workers when working with boy survivors, to help us in shaping the priorities of the initiative. So really in trying to understand what is it that needed to be done to strengthen their capacity to be able to work with boys in a quality manner and tackle some of the challenges that you raised all today. And you know, as you mentioned today, like one of the challenges was that because there is so much training that has been happening with on how to provide services and support to women and girls, boys are completely left out of the conversation. So the research helped us in understanding that frontline workers and in general service providers from the child protection sector or not needed to be strengthened in their capacity to understand the gender dynamics that are behind sexual exploitation and abuse of boys, but also how to, you know, dismantle these gender norms and roles during the support services provision. And it really helped us in giving focus and understanding how to move forward. And we're using, again, the evidence and the data collected to understand also how to involve practitioners moving forward, to how to consult with them to understand what would be useful for them in terms of practical tools and packages that can help them in their daily work with boys. The second area of work that we developed thanks to the data and evidence collected was the development of an advocacy plan. So it was very useful to base our advocacy on strong evidence and data and formal evidence and data that come from very strong methodologies. So not just saying, oh, we know this is happening, this is a global issue, but we can actually back all of those arguments saying, we have conducted research in so many countries, and this research actually tells us what are the different manifestations, what are the root causes, what are the challenges, the barriers that boys face in accessing services. So it helped us in giving us some more credibility when engaging with different stakeholders, from policymakers, but also to the donor community. And finally, the third area was the construction of campaign and communication activities. I think the data and the information collected also helped us in educating ourselves on how to speak about the issue and how to create messages around the issue that are clear and that actually make an impact. So here again, as per advocacy, what was important was how to use the information collected through the research, and especially through the voices of the boy survivors that were consulted, and use the right language, understand what their issue is, and translate it in a way that is respectful, but also relevant. And although we used the research at the very beginning while shaping the Global Boys Initiative, it is important to stress that we're still using it nowadays. So any new research, any new evidence that is collected is very important for us in also adjusting the intervention and making it as relevant as possible, as inclusive as possible. I really want to thank you all and thank all the presenters for the insights on the research. It's been personally very useful for me to listen to them again and actually give more nuance to some of the work we're doing. So thank you very much.
Mark, you were muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I'll pass to you for some closing comments. Apologies for that.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for fantastic presentations. I admire your ability to summarize such interesting studies in 8 minutes. So I'm going to try to follow this act by just adding some reflections. I sort of preempted some of what I'm going to say now in my opening remarks. And what I want to sort of close this webinar is thinking about a forward research agenda, or just identifying some of the gaps that we found while putting together this exercise. So we're very proud of the small contribution to the literature we've done, but it's also been highlighted that there are priorities that need to be still filled by a forward research agenda on the sexual exploitation of boys. So even with a strong focus, even when we aim to find studies only for the Global South, that wasn't possible. And I think during, I'm heartened by having participants from all over the world attending this webinar, and you yourself, the participants, are highlighting the gaps from Latin America and the Caribbean, some parts of South Africa, South Asia, other parts of Africa. So I think continuing prioritizing, expanding and learning about this topic in other areas of the globe, it's very important. We also need more research regarding how vulnerable boys, and here we are talking about not just heterosexual boys, if you want, but gender diverse children in general, are identified as at risk or as victims of sexual exploitation. We don't have enough on this. And I think Ana Lucia brought a tool, which is a sort of screening tool to identify which children or which boys are suffering from sexual exploitation. We need more on this. We need to understand that sometimes it's not an open disclosure is not needed. And this goes back to the issue of delayed disclosure. Sometimes children won't be able to put things in words, and people, frontline providers, need to be able to sort of identify these red flags to be able to screen and refer to services, even when there's not a clear disclosure, and to be able to sort of help them put in words what they've been through. There's also issues around measurement, as Chris highlighted. We don't have a unified definition of sexual exploitation of children. We've been hearing a lot about the element of exchange as one of the sort of definitory characteristics of sexual exploitation. And I think the field starts getting sort of into other areas and other definitions of sexual exploitation, such as transactional sex from HIV World. And so we need clarity of what is it that we mean when we talk about sexual exploitation of children, and how is that contextualized in the different sort of areas where children or boys can be exploited, because the definition might look a bit different depending on context. And with context and risk and definitions and clear definitions should also, like hand in hand, we should have more on ethical issues. So how do we ethically conduct research on this issue with boys that are at such risk? What's the way forward in terms of how to approach the issue ethically? Because we do need research, but we need to be very careful not to re-victimize. We need to conduct it ethically, and we need to be able to be accountant to these boys that are sharing their experiences, that there's no more harm involved for them when taking part in research. And a lot more needs to be done around that issue, given that it's such a sensitive topic. And I don't want to take more of your time because we are at the hour now, but thank you so much, everyone, for your fantastic participation, questions, and to the presenters again. Thank you for your great presentations, and to ISPICAN, thank you for providing this platform to present.
Thank you, Anna. Mark, any additional closing comments? No. Well, I know that we are at time. If you are able to stay online, there are a few upcoming events at ISPICAN that I'd like to highlight. But most importantly, this session, I want to offer our sincere appreciation to Mark, to Anna, to Chris, to all of the authors who presented. Editing this special issue must have been a fantastic feat of time and patience. And again, the information is so important, so cutting edge. This is the topic that we believe very strongly in ISPICAN and highlighting and disseminating. So it is our honor to disseminate your work. And again, a heartfelt appreciation to the Oak Foundation for making this open access, especially critical in low and middle income countries. And as you can see from the chat, that was a huge part of our participation today, and our attendance were from these regions of the world. So again, thank you to both of you. I know it was probably a labor of love, so much appreciated, and we're glad that we could bring it to the forefront. I would like to share just a few things about upcoming events at ISPICAN. Again, I understand, since we are at time, if many of you need to leave. But again, we just want to highlight this cutting edge research, and there are additional topics that we will be featuring in the months ahead. This is not the last time that we will feature any information on the dissemination of the, sexual exploitation of boys and the research that continues to happen on this topic. And just a reminder for today's session, I know many of you asked in the chat, the presentation slides from all authors will be sent to you. A full recording from this session will be sent to you. ISPICAN certificate of attendance. So again, please know that the information will follow. There are also, in the ISPICAN Knowledge Hub, there are external resources that many of our authors either reference during their presentation or used as part of their research that will also be in the Knowledge Hub. And just some things for you new at ISPICAN this year. We are so excited to bring as much information as we can to you at the lowest cost possible, and much of it being open access, not required of membership. We have multiple webinar topics that we will be marketing in the next couple months, coming for fall and for winter. So please keep an eye out for that. We have a new website that we rolled out that it hopefully is more user-friendly, with an updated resource library and knowledge hub. We not only have this amazing journal, monthly journal that we love to feature from, but we are launching an open access journal that will focus more on practice. So it's child protection and practice. So this will be a completely open access ISPICAN owned journal. So please look for that. And we hope that you, again, find it very useful, and that we can provide this data to action journal focus for low and middle income regions of the world by making it open access. We have a new member connection system. We have a professional awards day that we are kicking off on July 7th. So you'll see information in the next week or so about that, since it's right around the corner. And again, some other just amazing things happening. We are also so excited about our Edinburgh Congress, which will be taking place in September. Please check our website. Registration is open now. We had the most competitive abstract selection process that we have ever had, with over 600 abstracts submitted. We are partnering with local law enforcement for the first time in our history to really host a Congress, and to engage law enforcement was a goal of ours for a very long time. And I think you'll find that this Congress really has a very, very different focus, and a very needed partnership. And just, we encourage you to join ISPICAN for as low as $35 a year. We have access to all of these great publications, and really to unlimited resources and partnerships, both internationally and regionally. So anyway, we encourage you to join us, and so we can keep presentations like this free. and open access. So again, thank you to Mark and Anna and the entire team of authors, to an amazing group of attendees who were blowing up the chat box. So it was so exciting to see. You all are so engaging. And I think there were some really substantial connections made in that chat. So we appreciate that. Thank you to everyone. And again, best of luck.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.